These are not my words. This is the big idea from their introduction in their PowerPoint slide for this section. I'm not sure what to make of this section yet. I haven't figured it out. They say that we've talked about insider knowledge already. And in this section, they say that they acknowledge the inequalities and the need to do something about them. But what? What do you do? And so all of these authors are trying to deal with the fact that we live in this world and we produce knowledge about it, but what do you do with it? They begin with perhaps the most famous of the authors that we'll be reading today, Donna Haraway, who is known inside and outside of anthropology, in part because of her book called Primate Visions: Gender, Race, and Nature in the World of Modern Science. So she's seen as a commentator on sometimes primatology, sometimes science, anthropology, gender issues, race issues. Like I said, I think our most famous author here. It starts off with this sentence where she says she wants to reclaim vision. I would like to proceed by placing metaphorical reliance on a much maligned sensory system in feminist discourse, vision. Yes, that is perhaps the most confusing sentence that has ever begun an article that I've seen. No, there's more. Why would she want to reclaim situated vision? What she's trying to say is we do need to have views from somewhere. And to understand what the heck she is trying to say, you have to understand what she has been arguing against, this much maligned. Where is the malignment coming? She is starting from the viewpoint that oftentimes the word vision and insight was used by what she calls the God trick illusion to represent this idea that there is this totally objective outsider perspective represented through vision, which can give us this view from a totally neutral, unbiased point of view that has nothing to do with the world itself. And so what she's saying is she wants to bring back vision because it's been maligned as the God trick. On page 237 at the top, the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have put the myth into ordinary practice. And like the God trick, this eye fucks the world to make techno monsters. I'm surprised to just see that in there, right? So she's trying to warn us against this God trick illusion, which is often associated with the abstract white male observer who purports to be from nowhere, but is fucking the world to make these techno monsters. She also wants us to beware of what she calls the totally relativistic perspective, which is the idea that everybody's viewpoint is equally valid. Relativism is a way of being nowhere while claiming to be everywhere equally. The equality of positioning is a denial of responsibility and critical inquiry. Relativism is the perfect mirror twin of totalization. So again, what she's saying here is that people have tried in anthropology and other places to stand outside of the world and create this idea or an illusion of a totally objective outside the world viewpoint. But then sometimes people oppose that to this totally relative viewpoint, which says that everybody is relative and they're all equally the same inside the world. She wants to do something different. She eventually says that what she wants to do, I'll distill it down, she actually wants objectivity, but it's a different kind of objectivity. It's not the objectivity of someone who stands outside of the system, detached, neutral. It's through getting multiple situated positions, so multiple points of view on the world, but always keeping in mind that they are all situated. And so those would be critically evaluated. She says it's not just self-identity. It's not enough just to identify as something. That does not produce science. critical positioning does. And so the idea is you can't just have all these relative positions that are equally valid. You do have to critically evaluate them. You have to stand with the preferred positioning is with the subjugated standpoint. Subjugated standpoints are preferred because they seem to promise more adequate, sustained, objective, transforming accounts of the world. Interestingly, what she says toward the end is that her goal is to produce better accounts of the world, that is science. So it's interesting because she's not arguing against all objectivity. She's not even arguing against science. She's arguing for a different kind of objectivity, which would take account of all these multiple situated positions and evaluate them critically. If you thought this chapter was weird, you should read parts of her book, Making Kin in the Thulacene. I think that's how you pronounce it. Staying with the Trouble. I used to assign an article out of that book, but everybody got down on me because she started talking about critters and being one with the critters. Anyway, yeah, this was a tough article to start with. The next article is by Delmos Jones, Anthropology and the Oppressed, a reflection on native anthropology. I was sad not to find a good picture of Delmos Jones. All the pictures I found of him were fuzzy. Usually when you say native anthropology, what would you think about? What kind of a person would you think about in today's world? Native anthropology. Yeah, you'd probably think about Beatrice medicine. Why would you think about it? When we say native anthropology, what do you usually comes to mind? In today's world, that probably means, in some sense, implies indigenous or Native American, right? When Delmos Jones was writing about native anthropology, yes, he's referring more broadly to anything that is from someone within a group. So he's actually an African American anthropologist, and he's doing his field work and his activism within the Black community. So that's what he meant by native anthropology, just to clarify. He says at the beginning of the article that his concern is social equality and social justice. He doesn't care so much about anthropology or native anthropology. He cares about social equality and social justice and the manner in which anthropology and native anthropology relate to these concerns. So that's how he starts. And he also starts off as being fairly critical of some of these native anthropologists. He says that some of their criticisms and critiques aren't that much different from mainstream anthropology. I will argue that some perspectives presented as critiques of mainstream anthropology are often no different from the point of view they are criticizing, especially when, on page 242, they represent a population as homogeneous and cohesive. And so then he gives us this case of when he was doing his field work in a Black community with a community action group, and he went to see the board of directors of the community action group. And he presents his findings to the board. That's the crucial part of this article. The board of the community action group are Black people, and they are members of this community. And in his perspective, he was working with not just the board, but the parents who were in the community. And what he says is that the board was actually using the idea of unity, that is racial unity, as a device to suppress social, ideological, and political difference. He says that the idea of a unified Black community for them was more primordial than political, based more on principles of racial loyalty than on a specific political agenda, and functioned more to domesticate than to liberate. And so he's highly critical of the Black leadership of this community action group in this community, who he says were basically interested in getting their own power, or at least not addressing the needs of the parents and, in this case, children of the community, and instead stressing this idea of unity in order to say that his findings were wrong. And he ends up circulating his report to the community over the objection of the leadership. This article is super interesting, both for those reasons and because this is a reflection on his earlier article. So he says, I ended towards a native anthropology calling for the decolonization of anthropological knowledge. It should now be clear to everyone that decolonization is not always the same thing as liberation, especially if the process only replaces one system of domination with another. So again, what he's saying is simply because it's decolonization, which he advocated for, that does not necessarily mean it's liberation, because if you're just replacing one group of powerful people with another group of powerful people, even if they come from the same community, that doesn't necessarily make it good or liberating. Now, what's really wild to me is that he wrote towards a native anthropology around the year 1970. And in this article, which came out in the year 1995, that's the now, he says it should now be clear to everyone that decolonization is not always the same thing as liberation. Now, both of those years were a very long time ago. In fact, you sometimes hear people talk about decolonizing anthropology now, as if it's the greatest thing ever. But he said that he called for this 50 years ago, for us, 54 years ago, and that as of about 30 years ago, it should have been clear to everyone that decolonization is not always the same thing as liberation. So, man, he was way ahead of this game. In fact, I don't think we've caught up to him yet, and we're 30 years after this article. So I'm not sure. Our third article is by Dana-Ain Davis, who was first researching welfare reform. Who is she researching here? Yeah, how much power do these people have? Very little. Not much. The most silenced voices in the public sphere. By the way, who was president back when they were doing all this welfare reform and making it really hard on these women? Bill Clinton. He's the guy who pushed through all this stuff and helped us out. Everybody looks at him now and they get all down him and they think he's a socialist and communist and the worst thing that ever happened. Man, when you look back on the 1990s, he pushed through some seriously hardcore reforms that were pretty mean to people. A lot of the imprisonment, a lot of the border stuff, that all came in under the so-called liberal Bill Clinton. Anyway, just so you know. What did you do today in the service of the women and girls who are the subjects of your research? Exactly. Good question. That was a great question. So what she says, she draws on the work also of bell hooks and the phrase teaching to transgress, education as the practice of freedom. What she says this means is that she's going to be exploring the parameters of inequality and the persistence of structural barriers with an eye toward their becoming politically engaged students. Initially, when I read this phrase, teaching to transgress, I got scared. I said, I'm not teaching people to transgress enough. But if it's just to explore the parameters of inequality, I don't think I'm doing that badly at it. She calls this pracademics, which combines research, service, and activism for academics, and create action that will dislodge power. That's pretty serious. You're gonna go do something that's gonna dislodge power, change things. So she says that sure, tenure is important and all these things, but I am first and foremost a person concerned about fairness and equity, concerned that the voices of those on the margins be centered. So she is studying battered Black women, some of the most oppressed, you might say, and this is her primary concern. You might parallel that, of course, to Delmos Jones saying that he doesn't care so much about anthropology or native anthropology, but primarily about social justice and social equity and how anthropology contribute to that. This is, in some ways, a parallel statement. Now, I was trying to think about this, and I was wondering to myself, all right, teaching to transgress, that sounds pretty important, and all these things sound pretty important about the voices on the margins. But in what sense is that different from something that Ruth Benedict said and wanted to do a long time ago about the purpose of anthropology? To make the world safe for human differences. Is that all that different from what is going on here? Now, I think maybe so. But I wanted to outline for you my understanding of where we are as we get to the middle of this section. So, anthropology. Wait a second. What is the big idea of anthropology from way back in the big thing that anthropology came out with that made us famous? Yeah, that culture and learned behavior is more important than your biology, your destiny as race or as sex, so that gender is more important than sex. Culture is more important than race. Now, in practice, of course, anthropologists were mostly white guys, or a couple white women too, studying oppressed peoples. Delmos Jones says that anthropologists are often studying oppressed people, but they don't know, they have no idea about the implications of that. We then have, after anthropologists are coming in, and we've talked about native anthropologists in several different readings, and here we have some more. Native anthropologists, of course, are mostly studying in their own group. That's what makes them a native anthropologist, or part of that group. So we have this huge idea that anthropology has, and it is studying systems of power and oppressed peoples. But in a practical sense, for the most part, most anthropologists were outsider whites studying people who were outside of the system. Now, there was a significant contribution of native anthropologists. Beatrice Medicine, good, that's a good one here. In the 1960s, Laura Nader proposed the idea of studying up. And what Nader was saying is we shouldn't just study the oppressed or the colonized, we should also study the people who are making this happen. And she wasn't trying to say that because we want to make them good people, we want to understand these systems of power and what's going on. So you had, since the 1960s, you had also mostly white people, again, studying powerful people. So then there was this trend to go study powerful people. One of the good examples of this, I always think about when I think about studying up, is an anthropologist named Hugh Gusterson, who was looking at a weapons laboratory and the kinds of things that people did in these elite engineers who were working on nuclear weapons. Now, there are a number of ethical issues that are different when you're studying elite people, right? Like, remember how Davis said that, what did you do today in the service of women and girls who are the subjects of your research? You wouldn't ask the same question if you're talking about nuclear scientists, right? I wouldn't ask you, what did you do today in the service of nuclear weapons scientists who are the subjects of your research? You'd be like, no, that's not a thing. You're not supposed to help them out. They're already doing good enough, right? So it brings up a number of issues here. Now, question, what's missing from this equation? We have elite white people studying marginalized or oppressed people. We have native anthropologists studying their own group. Then we have a few white people studying powerful people. What's missing here?
Not like studying power.
Yeah. Have you read any marginalized people who have come in and are doing an anthropology? Let's say they're from Africa and they're doing an have you ever met an African anthropologist studying you in the United States? You have not. Because in fact, these are pretty people that are for the most part still missing. And so it's an interesting kind of thing is that what anthropology still doesn't do that I know of is allow people to come in from marginalized or native communities and study whiteness as a non-white observer. In fact, I know somebody who was actually in an anthropology program at Berkeley, and she was herself was a Black woman immigrant from, or child of immigrants, and she wanted to study whiteness. And she was basically bullied out of anthropology and is now not allowed, really smart, but wasn't able to do this because we don't like it. So it's sad. Not even in this country anymore. So this is where we are, and I don't know, maybe our next two articles, maybe we'll find something different than what we found.